All right, so hello everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join this workshop live or watching the recording. This is our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. It's held every Thursday from 8 o'clock to 8:30. What I'll do is I'll give just a brief overview of the workshop, and then we'll get into week two's workshop that's focused on regional cooperation and regional conflict. So note that if you want to watch the recordings, you can go to the schedule and video recording slide on the PowerPoint presentation, which is embedded in the course website on the iPoli-Sci assignment pages. And you just click on the link and it'll take you to the recording itself. So last week I did an overview of the workshop. And before I continue, I'll get a link to share this presentation in case you're not on the course website and you want to open it up so that you can either follow along or at least take a look at it later. So we get that set up. I'll post this in the chat for those of you who are attending. So this workshop is a new series that's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. So this is in response to students who've taken Poly 130 who've asked to have workshops that are geared towards the class topic of international relations. And so I've responded to the demand by starting this workshop. So we'll continue this one as we go forward in future semesters. So week one, I just did an overview of those different concepts and gave different examples. And in week two, what we're going to do is the following. So by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to describe types of regional conflict or cooperation. And you'll be able to explain at least one dimension of regional conflict or cooperation. So recall from last week that conflict is essentially where two countries have different preferences over an outcome. For example, a country might want to take more water from an international river than the other country that is using that water source will allow. And so there's conflict between two countries. So for example, here in the United States, we have the Colorado River watershed that obviously starts up in the Wyoming, Montana area. And it makes its way all the way through and down, in theory, to the Gulf of Baja, across the international boundary, and then down into the Gulf of Baja, Mexico. Now, over the past 50 to 80 years, the United States and Mexico have been in regular contact and negotiations about the use of the Colorado River system and the necessity of having that water flow all the way through for wetlands water purposes on the Mexican side of the international border. And at times that's been a conflictual relationship between the two countries, and at times it's been a cooperative relationship. So anytime where two countries have different preferences over an outcome, in other words, they don't have the same desired outcome, there's going to be conflict. At the other level of cooperation, it's this notion that countries could work together, or they can work with international non-governmental organizations, or they can work with international institutions. So for example, a common example of cooperation is the United Nations Security Council. So United Nations is an international body that allows for any member country to participate in its governance and its in deliberations over policy and other issues. And the UN Security Council is the body of 15 countries, 5 permanent members, and 10 rotating members who will present, discuss, debate, and then vote on resolutions related to security. So for example, one of the more commonly known resolutions was when the UN was debating and discussing whether the country of Iraq and the government of Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in violation of its agreements with the international community. And where you had then Secretary of State Colin Powell present the argument, and basically that vote of the Security Council to allow for action to be taken, or to support action to be taken against the country of Iraq and the government of Iraq at the time to remove any weapons of mass destruction. So the UN Security Council will hear those kinds of high issues of high importance, and can be an example of cooperation if they obviously all vote in agreement and the 5 permanent members are in support of any particular resolution. Now, for this workshop, I like us to focus on regional conflict and cooperation, and we're going to focus on this in the abstract this week, and then we'll give into details the following week. And I'd like to start with some examples of conflict and then give to reinforce what those examples represent. So for that, we'll look at our interhemispheric conflict or cooperation, intrahemispheric, between neighboring countries, and then between proxies for global powers. Now, one utility of thinking about regional conflict and cooperation in these four ways is that it helps you kind of situate geographically where it is in the world. And it's helpful because obviously the world's a large place, it's a complex place. And while you might be able to look at all of it like on a 3D Google Earth or something else, like when you're in the field or in the weeds or working for a government, working for a military organization, working for business, etc., like you're probably focused on a region of the world, not necessarily the entire world. So our first one is interhemispheric, and this is essentially between hemispheres. So what we see here is a graph that shows the different hemispheres that exist in the country, or in the world, excuse me, and we have four of them. So we have a Western hemisphere. Let me see if I can get my draw function here. And then we have an Eastern hemisphere. And so in the Western hemisphere, we have North America and South America. In the Eastern hemisphere, we have Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. And then in the Northern hemisphere, we see here North America, Europe, Asia, and most of Africa. And in the Southern hemisphere, we have South America, the other half of Africa, and Australia. And so when we're thinking of interhemispheric regional cooperation or conflict, we're thinking between these four different sectors. So what's the cooperation between, let me get a slightly brighter marker. So the relationship between the Northwestern hemisphere and the Northeastern hemisphere. So one thing that might come to mind is the relationship between North America and Europe, and the example of NATO as a regional cooperative institution. Another example might be between the Northern Western Hemisphere and the Southern Western Hemisphere. And so an example of this interhemispheric, in this case, we'll call it cooperation, will be the Organization of American Countries, or the Organization of the Americas, which will include all the countries in the Western Hemisphere of the world. One other example, we'll say, largely in a single hemisphere. So actually, I'll save that for the next one. Our next example is intrahemispheric. So this is within a specific hemisphere. So instead of looking across these boundaries, instead we're going to look just within. So I'll go ahead and highlight those. So a couple of examples include the following. We have here in the northeastern hemisphere, largely where Asia is, an organization called ASEAN. And this is an organization that tries to promote economic cooperation between Asian countries in the region. Another example would be, I would say NAFTA, but it's not NAFTA anymore. So it's called the US It looks like I lost internet connection, so I'm back. I apologize. Um, what was the last part you heard? Let me go and start sharing my screen.
You were giving us the new part of NAFTA.
Okay. So the new part of NAFTA is an example of cooperation within countries, but we can also have conflictual examples like between the United States and Canada still negotiating how and when to open the northern border to allow for the movement of goods and people uh, in that part of the country. So that's an example of conflict because they haven't reached an agreement yet. So intrahemispheric is within any of these four quadrants. Now, when it comes to neighboring countries, here's a map of the world. And anytime two countries either share a land border or a water border, you can have a regional conflict or cooperation. So one example I like to give, and I'll zoom in a bit here, will be a little dry, but I'll make the point. So Ethiopia, for example, is a country in Eastern Africa. It's one of the only countries in Africa that was never colonized by a European power. And the people of Ethiopia take great pride in that. One thing that Ethiopia has been doing is building a very large hydroelectric dam, and the country's government has seen it as its way of becoming a global power, a regional power, because it has that type of infrastructure, which essentially allows it to control water flow and generate power. And one thing that's interesting is as they're building this dam in their country, it's having an effect on water around the countries that rely on the river in which it flows all the way through to the Mediterranean Sea. So Ethiopia is building a dam, but it's having water implications on Sudan and on Egypt. And so this is an example where you have regional conflict between neighboring countries, and not just a single neighboring country, but one that is, in this case, three different countries, because they share, in this case, a water feature, a very large river. Another example I want to point to is here in the Southeast Asia. So the countries of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, etc. There is a river here called the Mekong. And this Mekong River, its headwaters are located mostly in the Himalayas in China. And the country of China has building many dams on different rivers and waterways throughout its country for both power purposes and flood control and water storage purposes. As they've been building that dam, it's having implications on the flow of water in that Mekong River system. And so, for example, during the Obama administration, they started what they call the Lower Mekong River Initiative to try to bring these countries together to cooperate on their use of the on the river, but also to put pressure on the government of China with respect to how it was damming up particular waterways. So you have an example of both cooperation between some countries, but those cooperative countries are in conflict with others. So that would be an example of neighboring countries having either cooperation or conflict. Now, the last one is proxies of global powers having cooperation or conflict. So, for example, during the Cold War, in this case, I shouldn't say Russia, say USSR. So the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic and Cuba had a relationship, so here and here, and it was cooperative because Russia was sending goods and armaments to the country of Cuba. Now, this created some, even though they cooperated, creating antagonism, obviously, between the United States and Cuba, because now we had the presence of weapons, intermediate and short range missiles that could attack the American mainland. So when you think of President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and if you watch the movies JFK, not JFK, but 13 Days, I'd recommend it because it gives you like an incredible insight into that conflict between two global powers, in this case, the middle proxy of Cuba. Another example, more contemporary one, is the United States and Taiwan. So here's the US, and it has working relationships with what we would view as the country of Taiwan, but which is viewed as a part of China. And so if you ever heard of the one country, two systems rule or policy of China, they try to allow for these former colonies, or in this case, provinces that have asserted some degree of autonomy or independence from the central government to basically exist. But there's always a sense of tension and conflict. So you might be hearing in the news media, that there's military movements in the South China Sea, which is this area. And part of it's largely is because Taiwan has always viewed itself as independent or autonomous of the central Chinese government. And it has relationships with other countries like the United States. And in this case, our cooperative relationships with Taiwan is viewed as conflict between by the Chinese government and us. So you can have those things. This last part I want to introduce, and then we'll get to our discussion, is like dimensions of conflict and cooperation. So while we're focused on regional things, right, interhemispheric, intrahemispheric, neighboring countries, and through proxies for global powers, we can ask ourselves, like, what are these dimensions that conflict or cooperation can exist on? So for example, we can have political. So like different political systems, like let's say autocracies and democracies have differences of opinion about how countries should function and how people should be able to participate in political systems. We can have economic, where we have open market countries, like let's say the United States, and we have closed market countries, let's say like China, that we would have disagreements in policy outcomes. We can have social conflict and cooperation. So, for example, there's many of the southern cities in the United States have strong business and goods relationships with the northern cities of Mexico. So like San Diego, Tijuana, or El Paso, Juarez, and so on. And so in those areas, there might be social cooperation because there's this movement of goods and people between those regions. But maybe beyond those immediate border areas, there might be some kind of conflict because of social differences or social views. Cultural is very similar to that. This would also include like linguistics. So like, for example, you might have countries that have a common language. So it helps facilitate cooperation. So if you think of Latin America, which would encompass any Spanish speaking country, you would have a sense that they have a greater degree of cooperation because they're able to communicate with each other. Religious would be another example, maybe countries with different large predominant communities. So in this example, I always think of France and how the country of France, as its Muslim population grows, the French government tries to enact more policies that would be viewed as repressive to people of the Muslim minority in that country. Environmental, so things like working together to protect waterways in the case of the Lower Colorado River system. Also, countries like Canada and the United States working to reduce sulfur in the air so that there wouldn't be acidic rain falling on people and places. And then what I like to do is wrap up and have our discussion, like what are other dimensions of conflict or cooperation that come to mind? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. Thanks for those who watch, and let's get to our discussion.